studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Tuesday, February 17th, 2015. Dr. Cornel West, acclaimed public intellectual and author of over a dozen books, speaks out on Black history, music, and art. And attorney Lisa Bloom, author of Suspicion Nation, joins us in studio to dissect the Chapel Hill killings of 3 Muslim students. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, Egypt has jumped into a growing war against the Islamic State group of Sunni rebels. After ISIS killed 21 Egyptians in Libya over the weekend, the government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi rained down airstrikes aimed at what they say is an ISIS stronghold in Derna, Libya. Groups on the ground released a statement saying they, quote, woke up to a disaster today as Egyptian military jets targeted civilians in residential areas in the city. But Egypt's military justified the action, retorting, quote, avenging Egyptian blood and punishing criminals and murderers is our right and duty. Meanwhile, reports emerged over the weekend that the U.S. State Department was stepping up its efforts at disrupting ISIS propaganda and recruitment efforts online using a strategy of, quote, counter-messaging. And a new CNN poll has found that 57% of Americans disapprove of President Obama's handling of the threat posed by ISIS. That's an 8% increase in disapproval from last September. Well, Bob, how significant is Egypt's role in the war, and are we seeing yet another situation develop where dictatorial regimes in the Middle East are able to distract the public from their own failings by going after Muslim fundamentalist groups?
Right. When there are these kinds of extremist threats, it's easy for other actors who may have their own human rights violations and problems to look somehow good by comparison. And that's always a problem. We see the approval rate dropping, but my fear is it's dropping for the wrong reason. What the Obama administration should do is, of course, what the United States should have always done in the Middle East, which is be upfront about the mistakes made in the past and try to align itself with truly democratic and humanitarian forces. Instead, the United States continues to try to play this chessboard game where it feels it can align the pieces in the right order. So if Egypt goes back to a dictatorship, that's okay. That's actually maybe good, but that's not going to be the long-term solution.
And here in the United States, a federal judge in Texas may have just handed Republicans a victory on the immigration front. Judge Andrew Hanen ruled late yesterday that President Obama's executive action on immigration announced last year should be put on hold, allowing a lawsuit launched by 26 states to go forward. The executive action could enable as many as 5 million undocumented immigrants to remain in the U.S. with temporary legal status. The district judge justified his action, saying that once people were given such a status, it would be a, quote, virtually irreversible action. The Obama administration has vowed to appeal the decision and released a statement this morning saying, quote, the district court's decision wrongly prevents these lawful, common-sense policies from taking effect. Bob, isn't there precedence from the likes of former Republican presidents like Reagan for Obama to issue executive actions like this? And after all, it's an extremely modest proposal to begin with. It's not even as sweeping as Reagan's was, right?
Well, first of all, you misidentified Reagan as president. He's Saint Reagan, as you know, and all activities by Ronald Reagan have been deemed saintly. So, of course, that's not relevant history. You're absolutely right. You know, it won't surprise you that if you put immigration politics, the Texas Attorney General, and a very conservative district court judge in Texas together, you're going to get crazy, and this is just plain crazy. This is a really extreme intervention into federal supremacy in immigration law. As you point out, the actions Obama took are well within the scope of executive actions of past presidents, including Republicans. This is a district court judge appointed by George W. Bush, who's got very right-wing policies on immigration. And it's in support of an untenable legal principle. It's going to get resolved at the appellate court, but it's just going to drag out the process, unfortunately.
And finally, an economist at Johns Hopkins University has found that 2 decades of welfare reform policies in the U.S. have resulted in the neediest Americans losing benefits, while slightly better off folks received more federal aid. Professor Robert A. Moffett studied families on government assistance from the years 1983 to 2004. And according to the New York Times, quote, generally unemployed single mothers with children saw their benefits falling by a whopping 1/3. Meanwhile, according to Moffat, quote, there's been this emphasis on rewarding workers and people like the elderly or disabled who are considered the, quote, deserving poor. In recent years, states around the country have also been increasingly adopting drug testing requirements for the poorest welfare applicants. Even President Obama's policies to increase aid focuses on working families rather than the poorest single mothers. Well, Bob, do you see this trend as the direct result of our ongoing criminalization and demonization of poor single mothers, starting, again, going back to Reagan and then continuing full force with President Clinton?
I'm glad you put Clinton in the mix here, because in some ways he's most responsible for this, because when a Democratic president allies himself with the right-wing principles, it sets them into stone even more deeply. You know, this is a surprising trend in what we call a Christian country, which is supposed to have Christian values. But it's not unique to this particular situation. Look at farm policy, which has consistently destroyed small family farms and helped out larger corporate farms. This is the way government policy has been going. It's to direct public funds to the already wealthy. And in this case, we're just going down a level. But it's really shocking because it ignores the fact that people are caught up in a web of circumstances. This isn't purely about individual choice, obviously. It's about the nature of the society we've built. So it's not only refuting our basic values that we claim to hold, it's also ignoring basic politics and sociology about the nature of the systems we live in. It's a really appalling trend, and the fact that Democrats are as willing to participate in it as Republicans simply tells you how far to the right politics in this country has moved over the last 4 decades.
Robert Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. We open our show today with an excerpt from a scintillating presentation by the acclaimed public intellectual Dr. Cornel West. He's the class of 1943 university professor at Princeton University and graduated magna cum laude from Harvard in 3 years. He obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton and has taught at a Union Theological Seminary, Yale, Harvard, and the University of Paris. Dr. Cornel West has written 19 books, edited 13 books. He's best known for his classic Race Matters, Democracy Matters, and his new memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. Up until recently, he was a weekly guest with Tavis Smiley on Smiley and West, the national public radio program that was heard on KPFK Pacifica as well as on NPR stations. His latest book includes Black Prophetic Fire and The Radical King, a book of curated selections from speeches by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that illustrate, according to Dr. West, quote, a democratic socialist who sided with poor and working people in the class struggle taking place in capitalist societies. On January 31st, 2015, KPFA Pacifica Radio in Berkeley hosted Dr. Cornel West for a sold-out event, and today we present to you a lengthy excerpt from that address.
I come from a tradition that says that the Spirit will not descend without song and without sound. And when I came in here and listened to the young folk bringing alive not just the legacy, not just the talent, but the genius of the Louis Armstrongs and Duke Ellingtons and Count Basies and Mary Lou Williams and Sarah Vaughan's and Billie Holidays, on into the Curtis Mayfields and the Donny Hathaways and the Aretha Franklins and the Sheila and Wanda Hutchison of the Emotions, of Scotty of the Whispers, Ted Mills of Blue Magic, Russell Tompkins Jr., the stylistics. That's the same tradition, y'all. That's the same tradition. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. And it is a tradition not primarily of entertainers. It is a tradition of love warriors who mastered technique and craft and tried to touch souls in such a way that even though you've been terrorized and traumatized and stigmatized for 400 years, you can still stand with your back straight, with a smile on your face, and with style, and connect with other folk, communicate with other folk. So you may come from a hated people, but you're going to teach the world something about love. That's what we heard here. That's what we heard here. So I'm not the only brother smiling, but it put a smile on Sly Stone's face wherever he is. Because that's the same tradition. And of course it affects each and every one of us, no matter what color, no matter what culture, civilization, sexual orientation, or national identity. It is profoundly a human affair. Oh, yes, it is. You know, our English word humando comes from the Latin humando, is the source of the English humanity. And humando means what? Burying, that we're on the way to death. When you hear this music, it comes from a black people who at our best have always been wrestling with forms of death. The social death of U.S. white supremacist slavery, the civic death of American Jim and Jane Crow American terrorism, the psychic death of being taught that you are less moral, less beautiful, and less intelligent, less human, and the spiritual death that you have no status whatsoever on the human scale, and therefore the only thing for you to do is to cave in, or give up, or sell out. In the black musical tradition, which for me is the greatest tradition of modern times at that deep philosophical level. Because it says even if we're on intimate terms of terror, intimate terms of trauma, intimate terms with stigma, the response is not to terrorize others. The response is not to stigmatize others. The response is not to traumatize others. It is to allow a love to flow. And we know justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. And you can't talk about the black freedom struggle. You certainly can't talk about Martin Luther King Jr. unless you begin with a spiritual and existential dimension that says, yes, we're going to fight for freedom. Yes, we're going to serve the poor. Yes, we're going to sacrifice for justice. But we're also going to have a militant tenderness. Oh, yeah. This music that you heard comes from a people who taught the world something about tenderness. And I'm not just talking about Otis Redding saying, try a little tenderness. That's a little different when I hear the folk, young folk these days talking about, say my name, say my name, say my name. Try a little tenderness. That's empowering for people who have been taught that their bodies are abomination. So when they're tenderly touched, they're empowered and ennobled. They're able to actually conceive of an alternative reality as opposed to the cold, cruel world that all of us have to come to terms with every day. There is no Martin Luther King Jr. without Mahalia Jackson. And he would be the first to tell you. I was talking to Brother Andy Young a few years ago, and he told me about seeing Martin after he'd been in that paddy wagon in the dark with a German shepherd for 4.5 hours. On the way from Atlanta to Reidsville Prison in Tatnall County in Gut Bucket, Jim Crow, Georgia. When he got out of that paddy wagon, he could hardly walk. It looked as if he had had a nervous breakdown. And he could only say one sentence. This is the cross we must bear for the freedom of our people. And he said, and I kept playing over in my mind Mahalia Jackson singing. And all of us can relate to the music preserving our sanity as well as our dignity, the soothing of a sweetness against the backdrop of the darkness of forms of death, be it catastrophic slavery, Jim Crow, or Jim Crow Jr., prison industrial complex, residential housing, segregated education. And all you need to do is look at the Academy Awards or look at the Grammys, and it's still Jim Crow-like. Oh, yes, it is. When you reach a point where the awards for rhythm and blues look more like the National Hockey League than the NBA, you know something's going on. And I ain't got nothing against Sam Smith or Robin Thicke or Justin Timberlake, but if they think somehow that they're the greatest inheritors of Marvin Gaye and Donny Hathaway, they got another thought coming. I appreciate their efforts. We had Hall & Oates in our day, and they were talented, but they knew there were footnotes to the Delphonics. We had the Righteous Brothers. We appreciate it, but Sam and Dave will make them sit down. And the Average White Band, oh, we love the funk of Average White Band. But as soon as James Brown and Maceo came in, hey, they got to take a seat, not because it's a matter of skin pigmentation, it's a matter of the standards of highest levels of what the Greeks call arete excellence, and a digging deep into the dark corners of your own soul and somehow transfiguring your pain into a sound that relates to people at the visceral level. That's what we're talking about. And Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is a product of that tradition. That's why my brother David D. is so right. The last thing we need to do is to deodorize Brother Martin. We got to keep it funky. Is that right, Brother Vincent? We got to keep it funky. And how do you keep it funky? You recognize that in the end we're featherless, two-legged, linguistically conscious creatures born between urine and feces. That's where we come from. We all emerge in the funk. That's what George Clinton, that's what Bootsy Collins. That's what Millie Jackson, which is to say, yes, that love push that got us out. And the fact that very soon our bodies will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. That's funky too. And that includes all of us. And that's what's so rich and deep about the black freedom struggle. The black musical tradition, political, economic, social, all goes hand in hand. You don't compartmentalize it in such a way that you lose sight of the integrity, the honesty, the decency, the courage, and the vision. I want to turn very briefly to the 4 questions raised by Du Bois before I get to Brother Martin. Because anytime you talk about any figure of the black freedom struggle, it could be our dear brother Mary Baraka. It's passed now 1 year. It could be our dear sister Alice Walker. It could be Toni Morrison. It could be Martin King or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer. It could be anonymous mothers, grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors who don't make the textbook, but who without their vision, their courage, and most importantly, their love, there would be no black freedom struggle. And we put them center stage too. Those the great Sly Stone called everyday people. Those the great James Cleveland called ordinary people. But Du Bois says there's 4 questions. he's wrestling with, and it relates directly to the question of what and who Martin King was. And this is Du Bois in 1957. He's 89 years old. He's been handcuffed just a few years before by the U.S. government for his work for the Information Peace Center. He's been characterized as working for a foreign government. He's under house arrest. He's living in Brooklyn. He only has one visitor, a genius named Paul Robeson, who was also under house arrest in Philadelphia. He said, I want to write a trilogy of 3 novels, and he did. And the first novel was called The Ordeal of Manzart. And you turn to page 275 in that novel. He says these 4 questions. How shall integrity face oppression? Integrity face oppression. The second question, what does honesty do in the face of deception? Third, what does decency do in the face of insult? And the last query, how does virtue meet brute force? I want you to keep the focus on those 4 pillars. Integrity. These days, of course, what do we see? Cupidity. Love of money. Everything's for sale. Everybody's for sale. Across the board, no matter what color. And I'm not just talking about politicians. It's across the board. All you got to do is just dangle enough money, and somehow they will defer. I'll never forget the encounter of Martin Luther King Jr. with Whitney Young and the other civil rights leaders when they said he's setting the movement back. You ought to be ashamed of yourself in your critique of the Vietnam War. You ought to be shaming yourself trying to organize poor people because we're about civil rights and you trying to go international and you trying to sound socialist. And what did Martin say? And Martin was a nonviolent man, but he almost slapped him upside the head. Abernathy had to hold him back. And he said, what you say may get you big money from corporation sponsors, but it won't get you a foothold in the kingdom of truth. That's integrity, y'all. Because he understood the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And he's going to keep track of those who are suffering, no matter how unpopular it might be at the moment. He's willing to sacrifice his popularity in the name of what? Integrity. And all he's trying to do is be true to the best of the black musical tradition. There's integrity in the voice of a David Ruffin. There's integrity in the voice of a Nina Simone. There's integrity in Miles Davis's horn. Maybe not his life, but his music. We talking about art. It's always bigger than the individuals who engage in it because they allow themselves to become part of a tradition that shapes them in the same way Martin Luther King Jr.'s life was not perfect, but he was made by the movement just like he helped make the movement. And when he was at the center of that movement, he was an exemplary figure in terms of not purity, but integrity. Oh, that's very important. That's why the Black Panther Party could still talk about something positive with Martin, even if they disagree with him ideologically and politically. Why? Because they said, this Negro is for real. He won't sell his soul for a mess of pottage. And it's why Christian folk could look at Malcolm and put his name on the wall and say, lo and behold, we disagree with you, Malcolm, but one thing is very clear. You're right when you say sincerity of my credentials. He's for real. Malcolm not going to sell out. That's crucial, especially these days. And this is not just for black folk. We live in such a market-driven, commodified, commercialized, marketized society. It saturates every nook and cranny, and the powers that be know all they got to do is just dangle some things. And lo and behold, folk come running. Oh, when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., that's like talking about John Coltrane. We ought to shake and tremble and shiver and quiver and say they human, but lo and behold, they set such a high standard of integrity. Oh, we're not going to play with them. All these folks can get together every January if they want to and talk about how much they love Martin. And what do I say? Quit lying. 72% of Americans disapproved of him when he, at the end of his life. 55% of black people disapproved of Brother Martin at the end of his life. Now that the worms got his body, now he's so popular. J. Edgar Hoover said he's the most dangerous man in America. Kept track of him every day from January 1956 till the day he died. Find out after 10,000 photographs taken of him by his photographer, the photographer was an FBI informant. Oh, that's not the Martin we like to talk about. We like to Santa Clausify Brother Martin. Turn him into Santa Claus, got a nice big bag with toys in it, big smile, everybody feeling good, no challenge, no unsettling, no unnerving anybody. Everybody just in on the celebration. You say, no, we're going to keep it funky. We're going to tell the truth. I was blessed to be in upstate New York a couple of years ago. That old black preacher came up to me about 82 years old. He said, Brother West, I want to tell you the truth now. You see this big old room you're in? You had 800 people here tonight. He said that I was here when Brother Martin came up here after he came out against the war. After he came up with his poor people's campaign, bringing poor people across the board, after he had his critique of plutocratic capitalism with the 1% owning at that time 28% of the wealth, now it's 43% of the wealth. And only 200 people showed up. I said, you got to be kidding. He said, yeah. And he said, and some of the black leaders and black preachers mobilized against him and told them not to show up because he was a communist. Believing the vicious lies of the New York Times, the vicious lies of Washington Post that said that Martin Luther King Jr.'s voice was an extension of Radio Hanoi. How mendacious can you be? How mendacious can you get? And Martin said what? He would step up in every speech after April 4th, 1967 in Riverside Church when he talked about the silence being a betrayal in regard to the vicious crimes of the American empire. That was a particular issue that had to do with how you respond to a vicious legacy of white supremacy at that moment. But I'm also concerned about working people. I'm also concerned about poor people. I could hear him saying, I'm concerned about the vicious legacy of male supremacy. He did speak honestly about the anti-Jewish hatred that was running around. He would still want to talk about anti-Jewish hatred. But he would also talk about vicious Israeli occupation. Oh yes, he wanted to be morally consistent because he knew that an Israeli baby is precious, but just as precious as a Palestinian baby. They go hand in hand. He's got to be consistent. He's got what Jane Austen called constancy. Concerned about a white baby in Newtown, Connecticut, but he was also concerned about brown babies in East Los Angeles, or yellow babies in San Francisco, or red babies in Canada, the Aboriginal, or what we call here precious indigenous brothers and sisters. That's the kind of brother he was. But he wasn't alone. He's not an isolated individual to be put on some pedestal. He's a wave in an ocean of a great moment in a tradition of a people who've been dishing out unbelievable love warriors since the first African stepped foot on this slave-owning land and met that slave auction. Here comes Frederick Douglass. Here comes Harriet Tubman. There goes Sojourner Truth. That's Martin. They go hand in hand. The last thing he ever wants is somehow folk to view him as the exceptional Negro that incorporates him into some national narrative of exceptionalism and loses sight of the preciousness of Letitia on the corner in the hood trying to make her way to school, a decrepit school, too often characterized by soul murder, what goes on the inside, or dealing with massive unemployment or underemployment, or indecent housing. He would never want us to sever that connection between his ascension and those catching hell. And it means the radical king forces us to orient ourselves very much against the dominant tendencies of the last 30 years in the history of the American empire. Because we have witnessed a top-down class war against poor and working people with massive transfer of wealth from poor and working people to the well-to-do. We have witnessed the financializing of a monopoly capitalist economic system. When Martin King was alive, it was multinational corporations like American Motors Company that were still oligarchic, but they produced products. Under financialization, it shifted to big banks. They don't produce products, they produce deals. The high level of profit making in the highly financialized capitalist world does not translate on the ground to increase wages of working people, so that stock markets can break records and hedge fund folk can break dance on the way to the bank. And yet the masses of working people and poor people are not just catching hell, but further and further and further behind. So that 40% of children of color in America can live in poverty, and we don't have a major public conversation about poverty. That 22% of all of Americans' children, each one precious, living in poverty and not have a major conversation about poverty. So you can have a president who talks about the state of the union and talks about how strong it is, and I say, my dear brother Barack Obama, you might be beautifully black, but you're spiritually deficient and morally underdeveloped if you think America is strong at this moment. I don't know what you're looking at. You're spending too much time with the 1%. You're spending too much time looking at Wall Street. Have you seen the masses of American peoples? Have you looked at the children, not just their material condition, but their spiritual condition? The spiritual malnutrition, the emptiness of soul, the moral constipation of the elites who might have a dim sense of what's right, but it stopped flowing a long time ago because it's stuck with greed and avarice and callousness and indifference toward the suffering of other people. That's the Martin Luther King Jr. that we need, the spirit of it. Now, one of the manifestations of that spirit is found in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Why? Because Michelle Alexander says that, lo and behold, if we're really concerned about truth and the condition of truth allows suffering to speak, then we ought to say something about this bogus war on drugs, a war against poor people, especially chocolate poor people, but it's poor people across the board. The quadrupling that's taken place since 1980. I've been blessed to teach in prisons now for 37 years. I just finished my class at Rahway Prison in New Jersey. We read Plato, we read Lorraine Hansberry, we read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, we read Augustine's Confessions, we read Toni Morrison. Why? Because they are rendered so often not just invisible, but superfluous. As Brother Davy D says in his wonderful classes at San Francisco State, disposable. disposable. And then that spiritual war on our young folk. We wonder why they can't play instruments like Ohio players. Arts programs gone in New York City. I don't know about Oakland. You see. Or they can make $1 million and some of them can't sing in tune. And Nat King Cole turns over in his grave. Carmen McRae turns over in her grave. Hit the notes right. You don't have to hit the notes right to be successful anymore. It's all PR. It's a culture of superficial spectacle. So much depends on how you look and how you appear and how you project yourself. Superficial image rather than substantial performance. I ain't got nothing against Beyonce, but she ain't no Aretha. She's a great entertainer, but it's spectacle. That's how she looks. She has to shake her thing. And all of the projection of the glitz and the blitz, and all Aretha had to do was step up, grab the microphone, sing the song from her soul, and you still felt something deep, very deep. I tell young folk all the time, Ferguson's on the move, Occupy's on the move. You got young folk hungry and thirsty. Now, what's your soundtrack sound like? What kind of music have you written in the last 10 years that's going to sustain you in the midst of what's coming at you, which is repression, co-optation, lies, and a whole host of other things? You better get your spirit intact for that kind of struggle, and Rihanna ain't going to do it. Now again, I ain't got nothing against Rihanna, but compared to Gladys Knight, come on now.
And we've been playing for you an opening excerpt of an event featuring Dr. Cornel West, one of the nation's most prominent public intellectuals. He spoke on January 31st, 2015 at an event sponsored by KPFA Pacifica Radio in Berkeley. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel, youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. A North Carolina grand jury has indicted a suspect in the tragic shooting deaths of 3 young Muslim students in Chapel Hill, North Carolina last week. Craig Hicks faces 3 counts of murder for the killings of 23-year-old Dia Barakat, his 21-year-old wife Yusur Abu Salha, and her 21-year-old sister Razan Abu Salha. The indictment claims the killings were over a parking dispute, even though many in the Muslim community are convinced it was a hate crime based on the religious faith of the victims. The 2 women victims wore hijabs. Mr. Hicks, a self-professed atheist, apparently hated all religions equally while respecting their right to religious expression, or at least that's what media reports are saying. One thing is for certain, he was an ardent advocate of gun proliferation. According to AP, investigators found, quote, 12 firearms taken from Hicks's condo unit, including 4 handguns, 2 shotguns, and 6 rifles, 1 a military-style AR-15 carbine, and a large cache of ammunition. That's in addition to a pistol the suspect had with him when he turned himself in. Still, family members of the victims are convinced that the incident was an act of hate against 3 young people with promising futures who were from the most persecuted faith of our time. My guest is Lisa Bloom. She's a legal analyst for The Today Show, NBC, and Avo.com. She's the New York Times best-selling author of Swagger and Think. She's written numerous articles for such outlets as The Times, including the LA Times, Huffington Post, and more. She runs her own law firm in Los Angeles called The Bloom Firm. Her latest book is entitled Suspicion Nation, the Inside Story of the Trayvon Martin Injustice and Why We Continue to Repeat It. And we'd actually had her on our program on that and other issues. She now joins me in studio to discuss the Chapel Hill murders as well as the trial of Eddie Ray Ralph for the killing of Chris Kyle, on whom the film American Sniper was based. And we'll get to that. But first, welcome back, Lisa.
Thank you, Sonali. So good to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. So first, while this indictment has happened against Craig Hicks, and essentially they're saying that it was over parking dispute, does that discount the hate crime investigation?
Well, it might. We hope that it doesn't. I know that the FBI is investigating whether it's a hate crime, and to meet the definition of a hate crime is not easy. The prosecutors would have to show not just that religious animosity played a part, but that it played the primary role in the killing. So that's being investigated. They're going to have to unearth some evidence. But I think the Muslim community is right. It certainly looks like, walks like, talks like a hate crime, and this is a very important crime to be investigating.
Now, how hard is it to establish the committing of a hate crime? It's essentially, I understand, based on finding out what the intention of the perpetrator is. And if they didn't write down what their intention was before they committed this crime, how are prosecutors supposed to establish motive if they go for that?
You're right. It's very difficult. I practice civil rights law. On the civil side, people come to me with race discrimination or religious discrimination cases all the time. They feel very strongly that they're fired from their job or they were beaten by the police, for example, because of their color. But it's very hard to prove without some direct evidence, some comment made to someone, a blog post, something on Facebook. Without that, I think the victim's suspicions may be right, but it's very hard to prove in court.
And so in this particular case, has anything showed up on Hicks's blog post so far that might be incriminating? I mean, he was supposedly cited and quoted Richard Dawkins, the very well-known British scientist who's also an ardent atheist and who has kind of made some Islamophobic comments in the past.
Yeah, that's probably not going to be enough. I mean, obviously, many people are atheists and they don't necessarily commit hate crimes, right? So we don't want to broad brush atheists any more than we do members of any particular religious community. I think we need something more. The fact that 2 of the 3 victims were women who wore headscarves, hijab, means that they were probably more vulnerable. You know, there's a video that was just posted online about a Jewish man in France wearing a yarmulke walking around, and it documents all of the sort of nasty comments that he received. I think women walking around with a headscarf probably endure that kind of harassment on a daily basis. And again, I think their suspicions are right. It's just very, very difficult to prove.
Now, the father of the 2 sisters killed say that when his daughters began wearing their hijabs, because apparently it was a more recent practice, that Hicks apparently became more belligerent. Some even report that he may not have known that the group was Muslim till the women started wearing hijabs because they were lighter skinned. Could such testimony from the father of these victims help to establish any kind of motive?
Yes, I think that would be one piece of evidence. You know, the best evidence usually comes from computers and phones and devices. And so forensic experts will surely be poring over whatever he has. It's hard to keep your hatred private today, given the numbers of texts and posts and chat rooms. And if they can find something, I think they'll bring hate crime charges here.
Right. Now, there are reports that Hicks often showed up armed to the household of the 3 victims. How serious is that? I mean, I guess it's legal, but if somebody came to my front porch openly carrying a weapon, I would consider that really provocative and unethical.
Right, and when they're coming to your front door to talk about a dispute over parking and sort of, you know, displaying a gun, brandishing a gun, and I'm glad you're raising the issue of guns because it's something that we don't talk about enough in America. Every country has angry or deranged young men. The difference in America is that we allow ours to be armed and to be armed with this kind of arsenal. And yes, shootings happen in other places, but they don't happen with the degree that it happens in the United States. We have far more homicides from gun violence than any other developed country because we have so many guns. And so this man was allowed to have this huge arsenal, including semi-automatic weapons. And unfortunately, it allowed him to take the lives of 3 young people who were simply students who weren't harming anyone.
Right. There is the larger context of growing Islamophobia in the country as well. A Pew Research poll recently found that Americans view Islam with rising hostility. There was a major fire on Friday at the Cuba Islamic Institute campus in Houston. Apparently an accelerant was used, and it's not known whether that was a hate crime. But how important is this context when we're looking at this triple murder, legally as well as just analytically?
Oh, I think it's so important. I think it's important for people people to realize that Muslims are the primary victims of extremism all over the world, and that the vast, vast majority of Muslims are opposed to extremism. It's extremism, it's violent extremism that we all oppose, not Islam. And we can't, frankly, teach enough tolerance in our schools because that's where it has to start. We have to teach it in our schools. We have to constantly reinforce it. I mean, I think it's such an important issue today. We have to reach our hands out to our Muslim friends and neighbors, not shun them. I mean, we're all in this together, I think, all good people. That's the message that we have to get across.
Well, I'm wondering if you think that, before we go to the other case, I'm wondering if you think that this incident could shock people into really reevaluating the rhetoric that we bandy about. The Christian Science Monitor had an interesting report where they cited the 1998 killing of Matthew Shepard, a gay man in Wyoming, which, quote, became a national soul-searching about homosexuality. The event contributed significantly to an untangling of deeply held prejudices against homosexuals, part of a shift that has paved the way for the rapid expansion of gay marriage today. And the writer says this incident could possibly shock Americans into doing some soul-searching over Islamophobia.
You know, I hope so. I know that on Twitter, for about 24 hours after this shooting, hashtag Muslim Lives Matter was trending, and it was trending because initially the mainstream media was not covering this story. And there was an outrage that I think began in the Muslim community, but that spread outside the Muslim community, where many people were saying, why isn't the media covering this story? 3 young people were shot and killed, possibly in a hate crime. You know, I think it swept a lot of people up in trying to draw attention to this. And I agree. I would certainly hope, I mean, it's such a tragedy that these 3 people lost their lives. And if anything can come out of it, it can become more awareness about the you know, the lives that Muslims have, the suspicions that they have to walk around with, the harassment that they face on a daily basis.
Now, the American and Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee found that anti-Muslim hate speech on social media tripled after the release of the film American Sniper. I want to turn to this next story, which doesn't focus on Chris Kyle, the sniper in question, as much as it does on his shooter, 27-year-old Eddie Ray Routh, who shot Kyle in 2013, is on trial. The trial has begun. Again, prosecutors are attempting to establish intention, right, which is a sort of common thread with the other story?
Yes. You know, the real issue at the root of this case, which I've followed very carefully for the Today Show, is mental illness. So we know that Eddie Ray Routh was severely mentally ill. I think that's already been pretty clearly established at the trial. He suffered not only from post-traumatic stress, but from psychosis, which means he had delusions. He was not able to separate reality from fiction in many instances. And Chris Kyle, whatever you think of him, and his friend, Mr. Littlefield, they were trying to help Eddie Ray Routh on this day. They were trying to help wounded vets. They took him to a shooting range, unfortunately, and that's where they both were killed, tragically. So the question for the jury in Texas is not, it's not a whodunit. We know that Eddie Ray Routh did it. But the question is, does he meet the legal definition of insanity? This is an old definition, which really hasn't kept up with what we know about mental health. And so the defense has to show that he didn't know the difference between right and wrong at the time that he shot them. So we're getting into a lot of detailed testimony from the police who recorded statements from this defendant afterwards. You know, you knew the difference between right and wrong, didn't you? He says yes. He says yes to that question a bunch of times, but he also says yes to just about everything else the police ask of him. He's, to me, I think he comes across pretty clearly as a psychotic man who's trying to please an authority figure. I don't know whether the jury will agree with that or not, but this is clearly a very disabled man.
News reports are citing that Eddie Ray Routh said, quote, "I told my sister I had to kill a man today. It wasn't a want to, it was a need. I was going to be the next one up there getting my head shot." I mean, that sounds like the kind of sentiments we hear from war veterans who are immersed for years in terrifying situations, either by choice or not. Sometimes they, you know, go there and then realize that they don't necessarily want to be there. Sometimes they go there and try to make the best of it. But they're in situations where they're constantly having to kill or be killed.
Yes.
and then
hypervigilance of
they come back
PTSD,
to the
yes.
United States.
But I think there's something else going on here, and that's the delusions, the psychosis, which is different from PTSD.
Okay.
PTSD is sort of the recurring images of what you've experienced in the past, having those horrible flashbacks. But the flashbacks are of things that did actually happen to you. Psychosis is, he talks about voodoo and animals and Chris Kyle trying to take his soul. It's kind of a tragic delusional self-defense theory. You know, we have about 3 times as many people with mental illness in American prisons as we have in hospitals. There are many people who could benefit from treatment, and we just don't have an emphasis on treatment of mental health here in America, which is so, so sad. I think the lives of the 2 men who lost their lives here could have been saved if Mr. Routh had been in a hospital, which is where he should have been. He was in and out of a number of hospitals. So many people with family members who have schizophrenia are just desperate to get help for their family members, and it's not available to them. I think that's really the political issue underlying this case.
Right. On the issue of this self-defense theory, he essentially thought that the 2 men were going to kill him. Are the attorneys trying to establish that he was insane and therefore felt that he needed to defend himself? I mean, that's a sort of insanity and self-defense plea all rolled into one?
Well, it's not really self-defense. No one's claiming, he shot these 2 men in the back multiple times. So no one's claiming that he really shot in self-defense, but that was the product of his diseased mind. You know, Chris Kyle, the last text that he sent to his friend, Mr. Littlefield, who was in the car with him just before they got to the shooting range, and he said that Eddie Ray Routh was crazy. He said, this dude is straight up nuts, or words to that effect. So it was obvious to everyone that this was a severely mentally ill man. That's really the tragedy, I think.
One of the threads that ties these stories together is the issue of gun violence and mentally unstable or people with a grudge having such easy access to guns. And it also seems to me to counter the standard argument from defenders of guns who say that, well, if everybody was armed, then they'd all be safe. Well, Chris Kyle had a gun with him.
Yes.
Chris Kyle wasn't able to, and he was a
marksman.
He was a marksman who was proud of the fact that he'd killed so many people in Iraq, and he wasn't able to defend himself with an armed shooter.
I mean, I used to host a show on Court TV, and I remember covering a case, I think it was in Washington State, where a crazed gunman went to a Jewish community center and killed a number of people, and he had a history of mental illness. And I had on a state legislator on my show, and I said to him, can't we agree that we should keep the guns out of hands of mentally ill people? Can't we at least agree on that? And he said, no, we cannot. Wow. We cannot agree on that. The Second Amendment protects everyone's right to have a gun, Lisa. And it really struck me how far apart some of us are on the issue. I guess we could not even agree that Eddie Ray Routh, who was psychotic, who had told people he wanted to kill himself, he wanted to kill other people, who was taking heavy-duty antipsychotic medications. I guess in America, we can't even agree to keep guns out of his hands.
I mean, when we talk about free speech, right, we say everybody has the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to run into a crowded theater and yell fire.
Right.
And so you would imagine that those sorts of logical steps would be expanded when it comes to the issue of guns. I also want to bring up, I mean, several people, going back to the story of the Chapel Hill murders, but also even looking at Eddie Ray Routh's trial, some people have brought up the fact that whenever we have a white American shooter, male especially, well, there's not that many women who go on shooting sprees, but that we tend to take the nuanced approach to examine what might have driven their motives, which is what it should be in all cases. But of course, if there's a Muslim shooter or somebody with a different last name, foreign-sounding name, darker skin, then we either use the word terrorist or, you know, essentially, and I'm wondering what you think of those double standards.
Well, first of all, it's definitely true. And it's even worse than that, which is there's going to be more coverage. There's obviously going to be more coverage when the victim, somebody like Chris Kyle, is famous. There's going to be more coverage generally when there's a white victim, a white, pretty female victim, even more so. You know, in my first book, Think, I wrote about my own experiences with mainstream media over the last 20 years trying to get stories on the air of other kinds of people and how difficult it was, and being told by news directors, you know, we just don't want to cover those stories. People aren't going to watch them. I mean, hats off to you for covering all of the important stories that you cover, which is why people turn to you for real news. But this is a continuing problem, absolutely. And you're right. I would also say Eddie Ray Routh was taken into custody alive, even though he went on this police chase. He was a very dangerous person. If he had been African American, I think the odds would have been significantly higher that he would have been shot and killed. And a lot of people point out that a number of white shooters like Jared Laughlin in Colorado, who killed a whole bunch of people in the movie theater, he was taken alive. I mean, it seems far more likely that white shooters are going to be surrounded, are going to be taken alive. African Americans we see over and over again. There was shot and killed by police even when they're unarmed. There's a new case in Washington State of a Hispanic young man just throwing rocks, killed very quickly by a number of police officers. Thank goodness, though, I think mainstream media is starting to cover some of those stories because of the groundswell of people taking to the streets and saying, we've had enough. At least we're starting to cover those stories more seriously.
Absolutely. And there are videos for both of these cases that you were just pointing out. You can see the dash cam video of Eddie Ray Routh being surrounded, throwing himself on the ground and surrendering, and you can just sort of picture what that would have looked like had his skin been much darker. And then also video of the man in Pasco, Washington, who was running with his arms up in the air, running from police when he was just shot. So finally, let's close with this issue of police violence, because last week, FBI Director James Comey made this wide-ranging speech about the issue, including why he thinks police may harbor implicit biases against people of color. I saw that you tweeted at length about it. Among the things you said was, quote, while FBI director wants us to understand police cognitive processes, I want him to understand dead, unarmed kids and no accountability. Lisa, I take it you weren't very impressed with this speech.
Well, listen, I want to approach someone who's trying to do the right thing with, an extended hand. I think the FBI director was trying to say something positive about police violence against minority communities. So good for him for doing that. But what I didn't like in his comment was that we have to understand the police and that they have certain biases because of their experiences. And we have to understand, I think he said it was a little bit rational for them basically to have racial biases. And no, it is not a little bit rational. It is not rational at all. And that's a big topic in my book, Suspicion Nation. Many people believe that, and I think it's damaging for him to sort of reinforce the stereotype that African Americans are inherently criminals and therefore if police shoot them, we should be understanding. No, this is an unacceptable state of affairs. Police must be trained in diversity and tolerance. Today, we have to stop having dead, unarmed kids in the streets.
Lisa Bloom, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you. My guest, Lisa Bloom, runs her own firm in Los Angeles called The Bloom Firm. Her latest book is entitled Suspicion Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it. This is Uprising. Bipasha Sharma is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Jennifer McMartin is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. See you tomorrow.